It began with a sound, the slow, deliberate scrape of a cane against the tiled floor of Terminal C. Not hurried, not tentative, just measured. Confident, even. The man moved with an ease that unsettled the onlookers. A slim figure in a dark coat, his collar turned up against the November chill, his eyes hidden behind rounded lenses that caught the yellow light above the check-in counter. In one hand, a folded passport. In the other, the white cane. It was 1997, the kind of cold year when cigarette smoke hung in the air long after the smoker had gone, and airport announcements echoed like distant confessions. The place was small, the kind of regional airport that served mostly connecting flights and business travelers. Its walls were lined with faded posters promising a world of destinations, though few who passed through ever went farther than Chicago or Denver. At 8:42 a.m., the man reached the security checkpoint. He placed his cane gently on the tray, feeling for the edge, listening to the metallic clatter as his lighter and keys joined it. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man named Carter, nodded to his partner before glancing at the line that had formed. The usual crowd. A woman with a child. 2 students arguing over a boarding pass. A soldier in uniform. But there was something about the blind man that made Carter hesitate. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the man carried himself, upright, precise, as though he'd memorized not just the layout of the airport, but the rhythm of it. The distance between the voices, the echo of each step. "Sir," Carter began, "you'll need to remove your coat." The man nodded, feeling for the buttons. His movements were calm, deliberate. Too calm, Carter thought. The metal detector buzzed faintly. Carter frowned. "Sir, do you have anything metallic on you?" The man tilted his head, as though listening to the question settle in the air. "Just my watch," he said softly. "It belonged to my father." He removed it, his fingers tracing the strap, the worn face, before placing it carefully on the tray beside the cane. Still, when he passed through the detector again, the buzzer sang its brief, sharp note. Carter's partner, a younger officer named Ellis, stepped forward. "Might be his belt," he said. But it wasn't. They checked. Twice. And that's when Ellis noticed something else. A faint, metallic bulge beneath the lining of the coat, where the inner stitching didn't match. "Sir," Carter said again, his tone firm now, "would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" The man hesitated. His hand tightened slightly on the cane, though he said nothing. Passengers were watching now, the kind of uneasy curiosity that spreads in public places when something seems just off. The mother pulled her child closer. The students stopped arguing. Even the soldier shifted, his hand brushing the brim of his cap. Carter gestured toward a small inspection room beside the checkpoint. "Just a quick check, sir. Procedure." The blind man nodded once. "Of course." He followed Carter's voice, tapping the floor ahead with the tip of his cane. Inside, the fluorescent light hummed louder. The air smelled faintly of coffee and metal. "Please stand here," Carter said, guiding him toward the wall. He ran the handheld scanner along the man's side. A faint beep at the left inner pocket of the coat. Carter glanced at Ellis. "We'll need to open it." "Wait," the man said quietly. There was something in his tone. Not fear, not anger. Something older, like resignation. "Whatever you think you'll find, it's not what it looks like." Carter frowned. "Then what is it?" The man exhaled slowly, his face turned slightly upward, eyes hidden behind glass. "Something I should have left buried a long time ago." For a moment, nobody spoke. The hum of the overhead light filled the silence. Then Ellis unstitched the inner lining, slow, careful, and pulled something from the fabric. A photograph, folded and worn, and behind it, a thin silver locket. Carter blinked. "That's it." The man smiled faintly. "That's it." But when Ellis opened the locket, his expression changed. Inside was a miniature portrait, an old one, of a young woman in a military uniform, smiling faintly, the edges browned by time. "Sir," Ellis said. "Who is she?" The blind man said nothing. He simply reached out, his hand trembling slightly until his fingers brushed the photograph. "That's not for you to know," he whispered. Carter exchanged a look with Ellis. They'd expected something, a weapon, contraband, anything. But not this. Still, protocol demanded they report any hidden object sewn into clothing. "I'll have to call the supervisor," Carter said. The man nodded once. "Do what you must." When the supervisor arrived, a tall woman named Reynolds, known for her no-nonsense tone, she asked the same questions. Who he was, where he was traveling, why the locket was hidden. He gave calm, evasive answers. His name, his flight number, that he was visiting an old friend. Nothing more. Reynolds frowned. "You could have kept it in your luggage. Why hide it like this?" The man turned his head slightly, listening to her voice. "Because it wasn't meant to be found again," he said softly. There was something in the way he said it that made her pause. But procedure was procedure. They detained him for further questioning. The passengers watched from the checkpoint as he was escorted toward the back offices. A quiet, almost reverent procession, the man walking with unshaken dignity. Behind him, Reynolds held the locket and photograph in an evidence envelope. No one noticed the woman standing by the arrival board, her coat buttoned to the throat, her gloved hands clenched tightly around a small suitcase. She had been watching the entire time. When the officers led the man away, she turned her face toward the ground. Not in shock, but something closer to grief. And as he disappeared down the corridor, she whispered something, a name, under her breath. The same name that was engraved, faintly, on the back of the silver locket. Inside the security office, the air felt heavier. The blind man sat at the metal table, his hands folded neatly before him. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second an echo in the silence. Reynolds stood across from him, reading the report Ellis had typed. "No criminal record," she said aloud. "No contraband. Flight ticket checked and valid." She lowered the paper. "So why hide the photograph?" He tilted his head. "Would you believe me if I said it was a mistake?" "Not easily." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it's better you don't." Outside, the terminal's loudspeaker announced the next departure. The man seemed to listen to it carefully, as though he could trace the sound of each voice to its source, as though every sound meant something to him that others couldn't hear. Reynolds sighed. "Look, sir, if there's something illegal here, you need to tell us now. Otherwise, I'll have to contact the authorities downtown." He turned his head slightly toward her voice. "There's nothing illegal. Only unfinished." "Unfinished." He hesitated. "A promise." The word hung in the air, fragile, deliberate. Reynolds folded her arms. "What kind of promise?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his cane, tracing the handle with his thumb. "She would have wanted me to keep it hidden. I did for 30 years. Reynolds frowned. "Who?" He smiled again, faint and tired. "The woman in the photograph." She studied him. The glasses, the steady posture, the careful tone. He didn't seem dangerous, just tired, worn down by something long past. Still, her job wasn't to interpret grief. It was to enforce rules. She stepped out to make a call. When she returned 5 minutes later, he was still sitting there, perfectly still. The envelope lay untouched on the table. "I've spoken with the state office," she said. "They'll want to ask a few questions. We'll have to keep you here for a while." He nodded. "That's fine. Is there anyone we should notify?" He hesitated. "No. There's no one left to call." Reynolds glanced toward the door. "You said you were visiting an old friend. Where?" He smiled faintly. "Here." She frowned. "At this airport?" He nodded once. "She said she'd meet me here years ago. I suppose I'm just late." There was no sarcasm in his tone, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd lived too long with ghosts. Reynolds sat down across from him. For reasons she couldn't explain, she lowered her voice. "Sir, who was she?" He exhaled slowly. "A nurse. During the war. We met overseas. She saved my life, and then vanished before the armistice." Reynolds blinked. "That was decades ago." He nodded. "Some promises don't age." For a moment, the hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence again. Then the door opened. Ellis entered, holding a clipboard. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you'll want to see this." He handed over a fax document, a faded copy of an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Nurse killed in 1945 air raid. Medal of Honor candidate posthumously recognized." Beneath it, a photograph. The same woman from the locket. Reynolds looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, this woman's been dead for over 50 years. The man smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "That's why I hid her picture. Because no one was supposed to know she lived." Reynolds froze. "What do you mean?" He turned his face toward the sound of her voice, his blind eyes unreadable behind the glass. "She didn't die in that raid," he said quietly. "She disappeared. And for good reason." He reached forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. "You shouldn't have found this." Outside, a boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. In the hall beyond the office door, the woman in the dark coat, the one who had been watching earlier, was no longer standing by the arrival board. She was walking toward the payphones, and if anyone had followed her, they might have noticed the small silver bracelet on her wrist, engraved with the same initials as the locket. By the time the sun had lifted over the runways, the small airport was already running on its usual rhythm. The echo of luggage wheels, the hollow voice of the intercom, the smell of stale coffee in paper cups. But behind the frosted glass of the security office, time felt suspended. The blind man still sat where they had left him, at the metal table beneath the hum of a single fluorescent tube. His posture hadn't changed. He didn't fidget, didn't ask questions. Just listened. To every creak of the floorboards, to every shuffle of paper beyond the door. Reynolds stood near the window, her arms folded. Ellis was speaking softly on the phone. The receiver cord twisted around his finger. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's right. He claims the woman in the locket is alive. The same one from the 1945 record." A pause. No signs of forgery. The photo looks authentic." He glanced back at Reynolds, then at the man. "Yes, ma'am. Still here. Cooperative. Blind. Traveling alone." When he hung up, he exhaled slowly. "They're sending someone from downtown to take over," he said. "Might be a while." Reynolds nodded. "Let's keep him comfortable." She watched the man for a moment. He seemed calm but not peaceful. It was the kind of calm that came from long practice, not ease. Finally, she spoke. "Would you like some coffee, sir?" He smiled faintly. "No, thank you. I've learned not to depend on what I can't see being poured." The remark wasn't bitter, just quietly true. Reynolds sat down across from him. "You said she didn't die, that she disappeared. What did you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, listening to the air between them. "It's not something I can explain easily." "Try." He paused. "During the war, people did what they had to do to survive. Lies were told, names changed, papers forged. She was one of the people who helped others vanish, soldiers, refugees, civilians. The day of the bombing, she staged her own death. There was a body, yes, someone else's. But she was gone before the first siren even sounded." Reynolds studied him. "And you knew this?" "I found out a year later. A letter came. No return address. Just a single sentence." He recited it from memory, his voice steady. "If they ask, tell them I never made it home, but know that I did." He folded his hands again, the cane resting against his leg. "So I did what she asked. I buried her name. I kept her secret." Reynolds frowned. "And the photograph?" "She sent it in the letter. Said it was the only one that existed. I hid it where no one would find it." He smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Until today." Outside, the terminal loudspeaker announced another flight. Passengers shuffled past the frosted glass, their shapes moving like shadows across the blurred light. Reynolds leaned back in her chair. "If what you're saying is true, why come here now? Why after all these years?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his face toward the faint sound of jet engines outside. "Because she promised to meet me here one day. Said if I ever made it home, really home, she'd find me." Reynolds glanced at Ellis, who raised an eyebrow. You think she's still alive? She asked. He nodded once. I don't think. I know. At 10:17 a.m., two plainclothes officers from downtown arrived. They introduced themselves as Detectives Hall and Mercer, both middle-aged, both tired in the way men get after years of hearing half-truths for a living. Hall, the older of the two, flipped open a small notebook. So, he said, we've got a blind gentleman claiming to know a woman declared dead half a century ago. Reynolds gestured toward the table. That's him. Hall nodded and took a seat opposite the man. Sir, I'm Detective Hall. Mind if we go over a few things? Of course, the man replied. Hall adjusted his pen. Your name? The man gave it quietly. Occupation? Retired linguist. Destination? Portland. Reason for travel? He smiled faintly. A meeting. Hall sighed. With the dead nurse, right? The man said nothing. Hall tapped his pen against the table. Sir, we did a little digging. There's no record of this woman after 1945. Her file was closed. So unless you've got proof she's alive, you understand how this sounds. The blind man nodded. Unbelievable. Exactly. But that doesn't make it untrue. Hall exchanged a glance with Mercer, who shrugged. Let's start with the letter, Mercer said. Do you still have it? No. I burned it. Her request. Any witnesses who can confirm she lived beyond that year? He smiled again, softer this time. Only the people she saved. And most of them are gone now. Hall leaned back. You're asking us to believe a ghost's walking around in plain sight. The blind man turned his head slightly. I'm asking you to believe that sometimes ghosts keep living in other names. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a plane lifted off the runway, its distant rumble passing through the glass like thunder under the skin. Reynolds spoke at last. You said she'd meet you here. Why today? Why this airport? He hesitated. Because it's where it started. During the war? He nodded. She was stationed at a base not far from here. I was flown through on my way home. We said goodbye in a hangar near the runway. I told her I'd find her again. She said she'd find me. Every year since, I've come back on this date. Hall frowned. Every year? Yes. Reynolds glanced at the clock. So why hide the locket this time? He smiled faintly. Because this was the last time. While the detectives continued their questioning, Ellis quietly left the room and crossed the terminal floor. He'd been thinking about the woman from earlier, the one who had been watching. Something about her had seemed off. The way she stood, the way she turned away just as the blind man was led off. He checked the waiting areas, the restrooms, the cafe. Nothing. Then he spotted the payphones along the wall. One still swinging slightly, receiver hanging. He lifted it. The line was dead. On the floor beneath the booth was a small piece of paper, folded once. He picked it up. A name. A flight number. Departure. 11:05 a.m. Destination. Seattle. The name was written in careful cursive, the same as the initials on the locket. Ellis looked up toward the clock. 10:41. He moved quickly back toward the security office. Inside, Hall was still pressing the blind man. So you're saying she faked her death, lived under a new name, and now, 50 years later, she's coming here to meet you? The man nodded. That's right. Why here? Why now? He tilted his head, listening for something only he could hear. Because she knew I was losing my sight. She said she'd come before I forgot her face completely. For the first time, Reynolds noticed something in his expression. A flicker of vulnerability beneath the calm. Then Ellis entered, slightly out of breath. He handed Reynolds the folded paper. Found this near the pay phones, he whispered. Recognize the handwriting? She opened it. The same looping script from the back of the locket. Hall frowned. What is it? Reynolds slid it across the table to the blind man. Does this mean anything to you? He reached out, fingers brushing the paper. The faintest tremor passed through him. She's here, he whispered. Who? Hall asked, but he didn't answer. He rose slowly, steadying himself on the cane. You need to let me go. Hall stepped forward. Sir, I can't do that until we verify this information. The man turned toward him, the lenses of his glasses catching the harsh light. You can't detain what you don't understand, detective. She's waited long enough. He began to walk toward the door. Ellis instinctively moved to block him, but Reynolds lifted a hand. Let him, she said quietly. Hall gave her a sharp look, but she didn't move. Something in her gut, the same instinct that told her when people were lying, said this wasn't about security anymore. The blind man stepped into the corridor. The sound of his cane echoed faintly against the tiles. Every tap seemed to pull the air tighter. At the far end of the terminal, Gate 7's loudspeaker crackled to life. Final boarding call for Flight 238 to Seattle. He turned his head slightly toward the sound and began walking faster. From the viewing deck above the terminal, the winter light poured through the high windows, catching the frost on the glass. The woman stood by the gate, her suitcase beside her. She looked older now, lines drawn deep by time, but there was something unmistakable in her posture, the same quiet grace from the photograph. When she heard the faint tap of the cane behind her, she froze. Slowly, she turned. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The crowd pressed past them. Passengers, attendants, voices blending into the mechanical hum of departure. He stopped a few steps away. I wasn't sure, he said softly. She smiled, small, trembling. Neither was I. He tilted his head, listening to her voice, and in that moment, he seemed to see her in ways no one else could. You came, he said. I promised. The words were simple, but the air around them changed. Passengers glanced briefly, then looked away, sensing a private gravity. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew something wrapped in a faded handkerchief. You kept it hidden, she said. He nodded. You asked me to. She pressed the bundle into his palm. Then keep this one too, until the end. He felt the shape, another photograph perhaps, and smiled faintly. I will. The boarding gate light blinked. The attendant called her name over the loudspeaker. You're leaving, he said quietly. She nodded. It's safer that way. After all these years? Her eyes softened. We do what we must to stay forgotten. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. They'll look for me again after this. But you've already given me more time than I deserved. He shook his head slowly. No, you earned it. For a moment, she reached up, touching his face lightly, fingers tracing the faint scar near his temple. Then she stepped back. Goodbye, she said. He smiled. You never said goodbye before. She paused. Then let's call it something else. The final boarding call sounded. She turned toward the gate. As she disappeared down the jetway, he lifted his head, eyes blank, but his expression filled with something like peace. When the gate door closed, the terminal fell quiet again. Reynolds, watching from a distance, felt something tighten in her chest. Hall muttered something about wasted time, but even he didn't sound convinced. The blind man turned toward them. You see, he said softly, she kept her word. Then, without waiting for permission, he began walking back toward the security exit, the sound of his cane steady, unhurried. Later that afternoon, Reynolds found herself sitting in the same office, the evidence envelope still on the desk. She opened it once more, studying the photograph inside. The young nurse, smiling faintly beneath her cap. Something caught her eye. The background. A hanger. The faint outline of a man standing beside her, half-cropped by the frame. Not just any man. The same cane, the same posture. Reynolds stared for a long moment. Then she turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink were 4 words. Until we meet again. The airport at dusk looked nothing like it had that morning. The light had turned amber, slanting low through the glass panes, stretching the shadows of travelers across the linoleum. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and rain, a storm gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. At Gate 7, the last flight of the day had long departed. The chairs were empty now except for the blind man. He sat quietly, his cane across his knees, the sound of the terminal fading into something softer, like the hush of memory itself. Reynolds approached him slowly. She wasn't in uniform anymore. Just a coat, her badge tucked away. She had stayed long past her shift, though she couldn't say why. He seemed to sense her presence. "It's over, isn't it?" he said. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "The plane's gone. The passenger list checked out. No irregularities." "Good," he said quietly. "She made it." Reynolds hesitated. "Do you really believe that was her? The same woman from the photograph?" He smiled faintly. "Belief is all I've had left for a long time." She took a seat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The terminal lights flickered above them, catching motes of dust in the air. Finally, she asked, "Who was she, really?" He tilted his head, as if considering the weight of the question. "She was everything I wasn't brave enough to be," he said. "And she carried more secrets than any one life should." Reynolds leaned forward. "You said she helped people disappear, that she faked her own death. Why?" He sighed, his fingers tracing the smooth curve of the cane handle. "Because the people she saved weren't supposed to exist anymore. Prisoners, defectors, the wounded, the lost. The war ended, but for some of us, the danger didn't. She made sure they lived under new names with new papers. But helping them meant betraying the ones she worked for." Reynolds frowned. "Spying?" He nodded once. "If that's what you'd call it." He turned his face toward the faint hum of the air vents, his voice distant now. "When her cover was blown, she staged the air raid story. Used the chaos to vanish. She didn't die. She just became someone else." Reynolds watched him. "And you kept her secret all these years?" He smiled again, faintly. "It was the only way to keep her safe. I couldn't see her, couldn't write her, couldn't even speak her name aloud. But I knew she was out there. I just didn't know how long she could keep running." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the bundle she had given him before she boarded. The faded handkerchief was still wrapped neatly around it. "She told me to keep this until the end," he said. Reynolds hesitated. "What's inside?" He unwrapped it slowly, his fingers careful, reverent. Inside was a letter, old, yellowed with age, and another photograph. He handed both to Reynolds. She opened the letter first. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The ink had bled slightly over the years, but the words were still legible. "If you're reading this, it means I kept my promise. I told you I would find you one more time. The world has changed, and so have I. My name isn't the one you remember. It hasn't been for decades. But I never forgot the sound of your voice that night, when you said you'd forgive me. I never deserved that forgiveness, but you gave it anyway. I disappeared to protect lives. But I also disappeared because I couldn't bear what I'd done. There were men I couldn't save, orders I followed that cost others everything. I wanted to believe that starting again would make it right. It never did. If I made it to you, even for a moment, then you'll know. I tried to come home. Yours always, E." Reynolds set the letter down gently. "E," she murmured. "Initials from the bracelet." The man nodded. "Evelyn," he said quietly. "Her real name." He gestured toward the photograph. Reynolds turned it over. It showed a small house near the edge of a forest. A single chimney, smoke curling into the twilight. Two figures stood on the porch. The woman, older now, and beside her, a young girl no more than 12, smiling shyly at the camera. "Who's the child?" Reynolds asked. "She never said," he replied. "But I think that's who she was protecting." Reynolds studied the photo. So that's what this was about. Not espionage. Not escape. Just keeping someone safe. He nodded slowly. "Love takes strange shapes, officer. Sometimes it hides behind lies that last lifetimes." They sat in silence for a while. The airport lights dimmed gradually, the intercom switching to its late-night tone. Somewhere beyond the glass, rain began to fall, soft, steady. Finally, Reynolds spoke again. "What will you do now?" He smiled faintly. "What I came here to do. Wait. For her." He shook his head. "For the memory of her. That's all that's left." Reynolds folded the letter and handed it back to him. "You know, she said quietly. Most people would have turned that in. To the police, to the papers. It would have been a story. He nodded. It's not a story. It's a life. One she fought hard to keep hidden. Reynolds stood slowly, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. I'll close the report as no incident. There's nothing to explain anyway. He turned his head toward her voice, a faint smile touching his lips. Thank you. She hesitated, then asked, was she ever really gone? For you? He thought for a long time before answering. No, he said softly. When you've seen someone risk everything to save others, they never really leave. Even when you can't see them anymore. The next morning, the rain cleared. Reynolds returned to the office briefly, only to find the blind man gone. His name wasn't on any outgoing passenger list. His cane, however, leaned against the chair by the window, as though it had been placed there deliberately. On the desk lay a small envelope addressed to her. Inside was a single photograph, the same hanger from the wartime image, only now empty. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for believing her." Reynolds held the photograph for a long time, staring at the ghostly outline of the hangar's doorway. Beyond it, light poured in bright, almost blinding. She never saw him again. Weeks passed. Life at the airport returned to its rhythm. The same voices, the same footsteps, the same faint smell of jet fuel and rain. But every so often, someone would mention a story. A quiet rumor passed between guards at the night shift about a man who sat near Gate 7, long after closing hours. Always the same seat, always facing the window. He never spoke, never boarded a flight, just listened to the engines, to the footsteps, to the sound of rain on the glass. No one could say when he arrived, or when he left, only that sometimes, when the lights dimmed and the reflection of the runway shimmered against the windows, people swore they saw a woman standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Months later, Reynolds found herself transferred to a larger airport downtown. She packed her things methodically, the way she always did. But as she lifted the last folder, something slipped out. The old photograph, the one from the hangar. She studied it again. The light through the open doorway. The faint silhouette of two people walking side by side, barely visible at the edge of the frame. Something she hadn't noticed before caught her eye. A faint inscription in the corner, barely legible under the fading ink. Even silence remembers. She smiled faintly, sliding the photograph into her coat pocket. Outside, a plane roared to life. The sound filled the air, deep, resonant, alive. For a brief moment, she imagined she could hear the faint tap of a cane, the soft echo of footsteps crossing the tiled floor, and in that sound something like peace. Years later, long after the story had faded from anyone's memory, an old maintenance worker found a small metal locket in the vent shaft near Gate 7 during a renovation. Inside was the same photograph of the young nurse, and folded behind it a note. The handwriting was careful, unshaken, for the one who believed in ghosts and found the living instead. No one ever claimed it. The worker turned it over to the airport's lost and found, where it sat quietly in a drawer among unclaimed umbrellas and worn passports. But sometimes, on quiet nights, the staff swore they could hear it. The soft scrape of a cane on the floor, the murmur of two voices just beyond the last boarding call. Not haunting, not sad, just unfinished. And if anyone ever asked Reynolds, years later, when she was retired and the memory had softened into something gentler, what really happened that day, she would smile and say the same thing every time. Sometimes the people we lose aren't gone. They're just standing behind us, waiting until we're ready to see them.